The sun that afternoon burned against my skin like an invisible blade. The sky was clear, too blue for the tragedy that was brewing, and the wind blew hard, carrying the smell of earth and dry leaves. We were at the top of the cliff, a place my own son had suggested for an outing. "It will be good to get some fresh air, Mom," he said, and I, as always, believed him. I, who had so often endured the suspicion of others, could never bring myself to suspect him. The son I carried in my womb, whom I rocked on feverish nights, whom I defended when neighbors whispered that a dark-skinned boy has no future. That same son was now staring at me with cold eyes, empty as stone. I remember the instant I felt the sudden pressure on my chest. It wasn't just any push. It was a cut to the heart. The body gave way before the mind could understand. The ground disappeared from beneath my feet, and for a second, the sunlight turned into a cruel glare. Beside me, my husband's stifled cry was lost in the wind. The fall didn't seem real. It was as if time was stretching in slow motion, showing every detail. The breaking branches, the shadow of the rocks below, the dust suspended in the air. The shock of my body against the rocks wasn't just physical pain. It was the confirmation that this boy, my blood, wanted to erase me from history. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. The air escaped my lungs, and for a moment, I thought death was inevitable. But before despair could swallow me, I heard the hoarse, steady voice of the man who had walked beside me for more than 40 years. "Through broken teeth and pain," he whispered, "pretend we're dead." Those words, spoken almost breathlessly, were like a call back to life. Silence enveloped me, but inside something began to rise. It wasn't just a survival instinct. It was a spark of revolt, a promise that this would not be the end. I kept my eyes half closed, my breath held, pretending to be just a broken body on the ground. The wind brought the sound of his footsteps at the top of the cliff, paced, unhurried, like someone who knows they have won. My heart, however, did not beat in defeat. It beat with contained fury. Time seemed to stand still. The heat of the sun gave way to the cold of the shadows as the afternoon wore on. The smell of dust mixed with the iron of blood made my senses burn. I remembered when that same sun, as a small boy, would hold my hand, afraid to cross the street. And now, it was I who was holding my husband's hand, discreetly, to maintain my courage. With every second I lay motionless, a certainty grew inside me. If death hasn't taken me yet, it's because there is something I must do. The silence of the cliff was broken by a distant sound. A muffled voice, perhaps his, speaking on the phone. Disconnected words reached me, but one of them cut me deep. Problem solved. My blood ran cold. I was the problem. I, the mother he claimed to love in public, but who in private he always treated with that impatient tone, like someone carrying a burden that was far too old. There, on the edge between life and death, I understood that his contempt hadn't been born overnight. It was the accumulation of small humiliations, of averted glances when I entered a room, of awkward silences when someone asked about my skin color or my origin. He was ashamed of me. And the shame had turned into hatred. I don't know how long we lay motionless, just breathing shallowly. My body throbbed with pain, but my mind was working with unprecedented clarity. If playing dead was my immediate salvation, silent vengeance would be my path forward. The wind stopped blowing, and in that heavy pause, I felt the world telling me it was not yet time to leave. Not yet. I needed to turn the fall into an uprising, the pain into a weapon, the betrayal into justice. And it was there, among the rocks and dust, with the still warm blood running down my face, that I made the first silent oath. I would not die invisible. If he wanted to silence me forever, I would use this silence as a mask, until the right time to rip it off in front of everyone. With every slow beat of my heart, it wasn't just life I was preserving. It was the birth of a huntress, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. My body still ached as if every bone had been shattered, but the greater pain wasn't in the fractures. It was in the memory. While my husband and I remained hidden, breathing shallowly so no one would suspect we had survived, my mind dragged me back in time, revisiting every step of the life that brought me to that cliff. I remembered when he was just a skinny boy with curly hair and an easy smile. I dressed him in hand-me-down clothes, even when they were donated, and I would say, "Stand up straight, my son. No one needs to know we're poor, but everyone needs to see that you are worthy." How many times had I endured the whispers on the bus, people commenting loudly about my dark skin, as if it were a public joke. I swallowed the silence so as not to stain his childhood with the shame the world tried to force on us. I was the mother who got calluses on her hands from scrubbing other people's floors, who learned to cook dishes I couldn't afford to eat, just to bring the smell of abundance into our small home. It was I who saved every coin, who gave up new shoes, who never bought a dress for herself, because there was always a school fee, a book, a chance to give him a different future. "Study, my son," I would repeat, even when his eyes were heavy with exhaustion. But the years transformed that same boy into someone who looked at me sideways, as if I were an inconvenience. I remember the first time he introduced me to his college friends. I was wearing a simple faded blue dress, and when I extended my hand, I saw the embarrassment on his face. "This is my mother," he said in a quick, almost ashamed tone. The friends smiled, but I saw the flash of strangeness in their eyes, the kind of look that weighs like iron and never needs words. From that day on, my son began to hide parts of me. He asked me not to come to important meetings, saying it was better not to mix family and work. I obeyed in silence, believing it was for his own good. Until one day, I overheard him tell his girlfriend, "She's a good person but just too simple. I don't want them to think I came from so little." Those words cut deep, but even then they didn't make me love him any less. I just held the pain inside me. Now, lying fallen among the rocks, feeling the blood dry on my face, I finally understood. All the effort, all the kindness, all the sacrifices were seen as shame, not as love. To him I was just a past to be hidden, a weight to be eliminated. He pushed me not only off the cliff, but out of the story he wanted to tell the world. My heart ached, but a flame ignited alongside it. I would not be erased. My voice, which had so often fallen silent in the face of humiliation, would now have to shout in a different way. Maybe not with immediate words, maybe with calculated silence, but it would be with strength. As I breathed deeply, even through the pain, I realized something clearly. If my son wanted to silence me, I would turn my silence into a weapon. Every memory of him laughing at my simplicity, every sideways glance from my daughter-in-law measuring my skin color, every time I was treated like a shadow, all of it now became fuel. And you, who are listening to me now, perhaps you have felt something similar. Maybe you have been belittled. Maybe you have been pushed to the margins of your own life by the very person who should have supported you the most. If they have tried to silence your voice, if they have tried to erase your presence, subscribe here with me. Because every story like mine deserves to echo, and yours does too. We cannot let anyone else decide when our voice should die. The wind that night seemed to carry a message. The world believed I was dead. And, ironically, it was this belief that would give me the time, space, and strength to return. I wouldn't just be a survivor. I would become the nightmare of those who believed they could bury me in silence. In the darkness, with my chest burning and my eyes full of dried tears, I made the deepest promise of my life. I would return and he would see me. The night had fallen upon us like a heavy shroud. My body hurt, but my mind remained awake, alert to every sound coming from the top of the cliff. Lying among damp stones, my skin covered in dust and dried blood, I felt my heart race when his voice rose against the wind. My own son was talking on the phone, never imagining that I was there, listening to every word. The tone was cold, calculating, a world away from any memory I had of the boy who once sought comfort in my arms. "It's done," he was saying. "Now it's just a matter of time to sort out the paperwork." The word paperwork echoed like a razor. I knew what it was about. Inheritance, documents, property. The love of a lifetime traded for assets and status. I closed my eyes for a moment and breathed deeply, trying to hold back the tears. I didn't want the sound of my pain to reveal my survival. Beside me, my husband, weakened, squeezed my hand tightly, as if it were the only anchor still keeping me tied to reality. I saw in his eyes the same fear that was in me, but also the same quiet determination. We both understood, without exchanging a word, that we couldn't seek help immediately. No one would believe our version. The perfect son, the respectable businessman, against the simple, invisible mother. For a moment, I remembered how many times I had been treated like a shadow at family gatherings. It was always the same. I would arrive, offer food, serve drinks, smile. And the conversations would pass right over me, as if I were part of the furniture. Little phrases tossed into the air, which now, remembered, burned like hot coals. She's good people but not very educated. Or, his mother. She's humble, she doesn't get involved. I was the silent witness at every party, but never the center of anything. Invisible. And now, ironically, it was this invisibility that would save me. The cell phone that had slipped from his pocket during the push was still with me. Hidden under my body, almost crushed against the rocks. The cracked screen flickered from time to time, illuminating the night like a timid beacon. I knew that it might hold the proof I needed. But it wasn't time to move yet. The most important thing in that instant was not to be discovered. I heard the sound of his footsteps moving away, first firm, then lighter, until they disappeared completely. The wind brought back the silence, and with it, a bitter realization. My own son had become my enemy. But there was more, he wasn't alone. On the call before he hung up, I heard a woman's laugh. Laugh I knew well. My daughter-in-law's. The confirmation pierced me like a blade. It wasn't just him. She was part of the plan too. That woman who had always looked me up and down, assessing my simple dress, my natural hair, my calloused hands, now showed her true face. I had always felt the veiled contempt, the comparisons to her family, white and respectable. To her I was a burden, an inconvenient reminder of her husband's roots. And now, at his side, she was celebrating the end of my existence. Lying in the darkness, I realized something that made me tremble. If they were willing to eliminate me, they wouldn't be satisfied with just the cliff. If they suspected I had survived, they would come back to finish the job. We needed to move, but carefully. The night was our ally, the silence our shield. Every breath was a battle. Every movement a life-or-death decision. But between the pain and the fear, something was growing inside me. The certainty that I would not be just a victim. For the first time in my life, being invisible was not synonymous with weakness. It was a weapon. The moon lit up the ravine, casting shadows that seemed to move like ghosts. I clung to one of them, deep in my chest, and swore that if my son and daughter-in-law believed they had won, they had no idea they had just awakened something far more dangerous than submission. The phone hidden under my body pulsed like an extra heart, and I knew that there, in that small, cracked object, could be the key to turning silence into justice. The cold of the early morning clung to my skin like a sheet of ice. Every muscle throbbed, every breath felt like it was torn from me, but I knew I couldn't give in to the pain. The cliff still held the echo of betrayal, and any carelessness could mean the definitive end. With effort I helped my husband to his feet. Our steps were short, shuffling, until we found refuge in an abandoned cabin we knew from long ago. The roof creaked with the wind, the boards smelled of mildew, but it was shelter. It was there, in the silence broken only by his groans, that I finally had the courage to look at what I was hiding against my chest. My son's cell phone. The device was cracked, covered in dust, but it still lit up. My heart hammered as if I were about to discover not just secrets, but the confirmation of the nightmare. With trembling hands I swiped the screen. The password was no obstacle. He always used predictable combinations, dates he considered important only to himself. It only took a few tries for the light to open up before me. And then came the messages. First, conversations with his wife. Lines and lines of words that felt like stab wounds. "We have to solve this soon, my love. Your mother won't last long. She can't be a burden when we have everything in our hands." Her reply was laughter typed in cold emojis, followed by, "We'll finally be free." Every sentence was a blow that made me gasp with indignation. I, who gave them so much, who never let them go hungry, who endured sideways glances to see my son shine in rooms that were not made for me, was now being called a burden, an encumbrance. Kept scrolling. There were voice recordings. I pressed play with sweaty fingers. His voice echoed through the cabin, low but laced with venom. My mother never knew how to handle money. She doesn't deserve anything. It's better to resolve this before she does something stupid. His wife's reply came soon after with cruel irony. And let's be honest, a black mother-in-law doesn't exactly match the dinner parties we're going to host, does she? With every word, the room seemed to shrink. My husband, sitting in a corner, watched me with tear-filled eyes. He didn't need to hear everything to understand. He just had to see the controlled fury on my face. The heavy silence of the cabin became more deafening than any scream. But there, amidst the pain, something new was born. I didn't just have memories of humiliation. I didn't just have open wounds. I had proof. Tangible, clear, undeniable. Those messages and audio files were more than insults. They were confessions. They couldn't be erased or distorted. I knew that no one would believe my word against theirs. I was always seen as the simple mother, uneducated, the one who doesn't understand these things. But now I had more than my voice. I had the raw record of the hatred they tried to hide. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. The pain was still there, but alongside it grew a new sensation: power. For the first time, I wasn't just a survivor. I held in my hands the keys that could destroy the perfect mask my son and daughter-in-law wore for society. I held the phone against my chest, as if it were an extra heart. The screen illuminated my face, and in that light, I saw the reflection of a woman I no longer knew. Not the resigned mother, not the silent wife, but the huntress that betrayal had awakened. My husband, though frail, raised his voice in a firm whisper. "What are we going to do with this?" I looked at him and I didn't hesitate. "We are going to wait for the right moment. They won't know when or how, but the truth is going to swallow them whole, in front of everyone." In that instant, I understood that the fall from the cliff had not been the end. It was just the beginning of a silent vengeance, fueled by proof that burned in my hands like a fire about to spread. Returning to the city was like walking through a cracked mirror. Every street looked the same, but I was no longer the woman who used to walk with her head down. Still, I maintained the disguise of silence. I needed to observe, listen, and gather the pieces before I attacked. My body still bore the wounds from the fall, but I learned to hide them under loose clothing, just as I had always hidden the invisible scars left by looks of contempt. A few days later, I learned of the memorial service they had organized for me and my husband. A memorial service with no body, no real tears, just a spectacle to close the story of the inconvenient mother. I slipped in discreetly, staying at a distance, hidden among faces that barely noticed me when I was alive. The hall was too brightly lit, decorated with expensive flowers and white arrangements that exuded a fake perfume. Relatives, neighbors, and business colleagues were there. Everyone was praising my son for his strength and his ability to move forward in the face of such a loss. The words passed through my ears like dull knives. "He was always such a good boy. He's an example of resilience." Some lower whispers, however, carried an even crueler venom. A woman's voice commented, "Now he can get on with his life without that weight." Another, almost laughing, said, "The family can finally present themselves without being ashamed." It was just too much of a contrast, you know. I didn't need to ask what they meant. I was the shame. My skin, my manner, my origin. My heart was on fire, but I remained motionless. Silence was my cloak. The phone with the proof was hidden in my pocket, weighing more than any stone. I wanted to scream, I wanted to show every message, every audio file right then. But it wasn't time. The silence, which had so often wounded me, now became my ally. I would not be rash. As I watched, my eyes fixed on my daughter-in-law's face. She was smiling with that triumphant air, her red lips highlighting the victory she believed she had achieved. With every greeting, she leaned in with rehearsed elegance, as if she had won a title by getting rid of me. I saw her discreetly adjust her gold wedding band, displaying it like a trophy. The son I raised stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, faking a sadness for anyone who wanted to believe it. I felt my throat burn, not with tears but with rage. But instead of letting the scream escape, I took a deep breath. The silence I maintained in that hall was the loudest of my life, because inside me it was screaming. And it was screaming a promise that one day, in front of everyone, my voice would return. And it's at this point that I turn to you, who are following my story. Have you ever felt that kind of silence? Have you ever been in a place where every word spoken about you seemed to erase you, while no one noticed your pain? If you have suffered from looks that diminished you or phrases that tried to erase your existence, like this video and comment below. Your voice needs to echo along with mine, because none of us deserves to be erased in silence. The memorial service continued as if it were a celebration, not a farewell. When the priest spoke of respecting the memory, I almost let out a bitter laugh. What memory? They wanted to erase me, not remember me. But they had no idea I was there, alive, breathing among them, hearing every word that would serve as fuel for the right time. I left before the end, still invisible, still a shadow. But every step I took out of that hall was firm. I wasn't just surviving, I was preparing the ground. And the silence, which for so long had been a prison, was now the loudest scream I could carry. As I walked away, I clutched the phone in my pocket and thought, they haven't heard my voice yet, but when they do, it will be impossible to forget. Returning home after that fake memorial service was like stepping on sacred and profane ground at the same time. Every corner of my home seemed to carry memories of a lifetime, but now those memories were stained. I ran my eyes over the old photographs. My son as a boy, smiling without shame, my husband with strong arms holding him on his shoulders, and it all seemed like a lie, as if the images were masks that never revealed his true face. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a cell phone in front of me. The broken screen reflected my own image, a woman marked by time, by pain, by struggle, but with different eyes. They were no longer the submissive eyes of before. They were the eyes of someone carrying a silent weapon. I knew it wasn't enough to have the proof. I had to organize it, turn messages and audio files into something impossible to deny. That's when I sought help from someone who had always seen me as a person, not a shadow. Dona Rosa, my neighbor. A strong woman, who had stood by me in so many silent battles against the prejudice in our neighborhood. When I showed her the audio files, she didn't hide her indignation. "They are going to pay my sister," she said, her voice trembling. With her help, we printed messages, downloaded files, put everything into organized folders. I watched each recording repeatedly, listening to every word loaded with contempt, until the venom turned into medicine inside me. Meanwhile, I watched my son and daughter-in-law's movements from a distance. They walked around the city as if nothing had happened, smiling at dinners, organizing meetings, projecting an image of a perfect, promising couple. In the photos that circulated, they seemed to embody the successful future that everyone applauded. But I knew the rot behind that social makeup. I discovered even more when, digging through old documents, I realized he had forged signatures on property papers. He had used my name, my inheritance, as if it were just another obstacle to be overcome. Among the records, I saw a detail that made me shudder. In one meeting, he had apparently said that, "My mother would never understand any of this after all, she's too simple." The word simple, spat out like an offense, was like gasoline on an already lit fire. I spent days in silence, but it wasn't the silence of resignation. It was the silence of the hunt. I rehearsed the words I would use in the mirror, practicing the firmness of my gaze, like an actress preparing for her most important scene. What was once fragility was now strategy. I knew the moment would come. Some public occasion, some event where they would be surrounded by witnesses. And I would be there, not as a ghost, but as the truth incarnate. The weight of invisibility, which had crushed me so many times, would now become the force of an inevitable impact. Deep down there was also fear. What if I failed? What if no one believed me, even with proof? But this fear didn't paralyze me. On the contrary, It made me plan every detail with even more care. I could not make a mistake. This wasn't just about my revenge. It was about all the times that women like me had been silenced, belittled, erased. In that dark kitchen, with the dim light illuminating only the phone and the stacks of documents, I lifted my head and said aloud, as if speaking to the world, "They are going to hear me. And they will hear me in a way they can never erase." In the silence of the early morning, there was no longer room for doubt. I was no longer the invisible mother. I was the shadow walking behind them, waiting only for the right moment to reveal myself in the light. The invitation arrived in my hands as if destiny had placed it there. Dona Rosa, always attentive to the neighborhood gossip, brought the news. My son and his wife were organizing a large dinner for investors, business leaders, and acquaintances. It was to be a night of celebration, announcing a new cycle in the family's business. Little did they know that this cycle would be interrupted by the truth I carried with me. The news hit me like a sign. It was the opportunity one had been waiting for. A public event surrounded by witnesses, where their masks would be most polished, and therefore more fragile. I decided that was where I would reveal everything. The preceding days were all preparation. I reviewed every piece of proof as if rehearsing a play. Audio files, printed messages, copies of forged documents, even photos of the cliff I had taken after regaining my strength. Every detail had to be ready. I couldn't afford to be just an angry mother. I had to be the incarnation of the truth. My husband, still frail, insisted on accompanying me. "If you are going to face the world, you will not face it alone," he said, leaning on his makeshift cane. His eyes reflected exhaustion but also pride. Between us was a silent alliance, forged over decades of struggle. If our son wanted to erase us, he didn't understand that together, we were stronger than any betrayal. On the appointed night, I dressed simply, as I always had. No expensive dresses or flashy jewelry. I chose a dark, discreet fabric that conveyed the seriousness of my presence. I didn't want to be remembered for my clothes, but for the truth I carried. I looked at myself in the mirror before leaving and saw a different woman. No longer the invisible mother, no longer the humiliated shadow. I saw a silent warrior, about to turn pain into a weapon. The hall where the event was held was luxurious. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, reflecting light onto wine glasses and bountiful tables. People arrived dressed in smiles and expensive perfumes, applauding my son and daughter-in-law as if they were a perfect couple. He, in a well-tailored suit, displayed a theatrical confidence. She, in a red dress, seemed to savor every look of approval. I entered in silence. Few recognized me immediately. Some froze as if seeing a ghost. Others looked away, unable to face the impossible. The presence of my husband at my side, even bent over in pain, reinforced the reality. We were not dead. We were alive and ready. The atmosphere in the hall shifted. Murmurs rippled through the tables like an electric current. I walked slowly, hearing my steps echo on the marble, until I reached the center. I felt the eyes on me, some of an astonishment, others of discomfort. My daughter-in-law turned pale, her hands trembling as she held her glass. My son, however, was the one who most revealed the truth. The wine slipped from his hand, staining his suit. Fear cannot be hidden by expensive clothes. I stopped in front of them, took a deep breath, and let the silence fill the space. The same silence that had suffocated me so many times now transformed into power. Everyone was waiting. And I knew. The moment had arrived. With a simple gesture, I opened my bag and touched the phone. The truth was there, ready to be spat in everyone's face. And nothing, absolutely nothing, could stop it. The entire hall seemed to have frozen in time as I held the cell phone in my hand. Its weight was far more than metal and glass. It was the weight of my life, my pain, and, above all, my truth. My son tried to compose himself, wiping up the spilled wine as if that detail were the biggest problem of the night. My daughter-in-law, pale as a candle, couldn't take her eyes off me. The audience watched in silence, anxious, not knowing if they were witnessing a miracle or a scandal. I took a deep breath, raised the device, and connected it to the hall's projector. The screen lit up with the messages. Cold, merciless letters began to appear before everyone. "We have to solve this soon, my love. Your mother won't last long. She can't be a burden when we have everything in our hands." A murmur went through the hall. People looked at each other, disbelieving. The silence that once diminished me now transformed into an audience for their downfall. My son took a step forward, holding out his hand. "That means nothing, Mother. It's talk taken out of context." But his voice faltered. I said nothing. I just played another file. An audio clip echoed loudly through the speakers. My daughter-in-law's laugh, crystal clear and cruel. Then the sentence. "And let's be honest, a black mother-in-law doesn't exactly match the dinner parties we're going to host, does she?" It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Glances immediately turned to her. Some guests stood up, outraged. Others shook their heads, embarrassed. I remained firm, letting every word hit them like a sharp knife. My son tried to turn off the projector, but it was too late. Every piece of proof I showed was a stone dismantling the facade they had so carefully built. The messages, the audio files, even the forged documents appeared on the screen, one after another. Every printed line, every recorded voice was a public confession. While they despaired, I remained calm. It was as if I could finally breathe after being submerged for years. The silence that had suffocated me my entire life was now the weapon exploding in their faces, in front of witnesses who could never forget. I saw the faces of some guests reflecting shame. I saw others, especially black women from the neighborhood who had been called simple as many times as I had, discreetly lift their chins in solidarity. My pain was no longer just mine, it was collective. And that is why I say to you who are with me in this story, if you know someone who has been silenced, belittled, or rejected simply because of their skin color or their age, share this story. It is not just about me. It is about all of us who have been pushed into the shadows and called a burden. By sharing, you become part of this moral vengeance, showing that we will not stay silent ever again. My son was shouting, trying to defend himself. "This is a lie. Manipulation. She was always weak, she never knew anything." But his words sounded empty against the raw power of the audio. The audience no longer believed him. With every attempt to justify himself, the mask cracked even more. I, standing firm, looked around. The hall that once ignored me now listened to me. My voice was not just mine. It was the voice they tried to kill, and it had returned louder than ever. I was not dead. I never was. There was still the most devastating audio file left, the one that would rip the floor out from under them once and for all. And I was about to release it in front of everyone. The hall was already breathing a different atmosphere, no longer one of a party, but of an expectation as sharp as a razor. I felt every gaze like a spotlight. Every collective breath seemed to be held to hear the outcome. There was an electric tension in the air, the kind that precedes the fall of a castle. I felt my husband's hand squeeze mine, weak but firm. He knew, as I knew, that there was still one last message, the final piece that would make everything collapse for good. I switched files calmly, almost ceremonially. The screen went blue for a second before projecting the new recording. It was short, a seemingly banal conversation, but loaded with venom and certainty, the clearest confession of all. The daughter-in-law's voice came first, summarizing what they had planned from the beginning. Stifled laughter, cutting phrases, the tone of someone celebrating before the sentence. She said, with that mix of contempt and triumph I had known so many times, "When this is all settled, no one will even remember her. It will be as if she never existed." And then, his laugh, light, confident, the laugh of a man who believed he had closed the circle. The recording continued, and unfiltered, came the sentence that was only meant to be spoken in secret, far from compassionate eyes. "No one is going to believe a simple mother. She was always capable of anything except understanding business. That works in our favor." That last part sounded like a hammer hitting cold metal. The guests, who until then had been murmuring, froze. Stamped on the faces around me was the same mix of shock and disgust that I felt every time someone let slip a microaggression masked as an opinion. But now it wasn't just stray words. It was proof of intent. It was the clear acknowledgement that they wanted to erase me so they could shine. He tried, his voice trembling, to regain control. That was taken out of context. You're manipulating, mother. But the context was right there, raw and explicit. There was no denying it. The final clip brought even more. Short images. Photos of the cliff, a recording of the moment he was on the phone before getting back in the car. In the images, his hand was shaking, the expression of someone who had committed an act and was already trying to cover it up. The last image froze on his face, in the instant before the fall. The satisfaction of someone who believed they had won. The vibration in the hall changed completely. Some stood up, dismayed. Others turned their heads, unable to watch. Lips tightened. The daughter-in-law collapsed in a corner, covering her face, while my son searched, wide-eyed, for a face that would still defend him. There was no plausible defense there, only the mask that had fallen completely. I felt in that moment that the revenge was not just mine. It was for all the women who had heard whispers about not fitting in certain environments, for all the grandparents called a burden, for all the mothers who saw their love turn into someone else's shame. The truth I brought to light on that screen was, at the same time, a lashing and a catharsis. Beside me, one of the businesswomen who frequented the same circles my son so desperately wanted to be a part of raised her voice with simple strength. This is unacceptable. No one can plan another person's death for convenience. That sentence, spoken so clearly and directly, began to form a chain. People reached for their phones, some to record, others to call for help. The justice I had hoped for, once invisible, began to materialize in the very presence of those witnessing eyes. And I finally breathed. It wasn't the kind of relief that erases pain, but the breath of someone who has fulfilled part of their destiny. The final audio had done its job, exposed the intent, ripped off the mask, turned silence into an accusation. As the majority moved toward their phones and some whispered in shock, I heard a sound that froze my veins, decisive, firm footsteps coming from the entrance of the hall, and a voice I didn't expect to recognize, saying only, "I saw everything." The entire hall turned its eyes and ears when that voice echoed from the entrance. I saw everything. It was one of our oldest neighbors, a simple man, who had once helped me carry my bags when no one else offered a hand. He walked to the center with firm steps, and his presence seemed to break through the curtain of doubt my son was still trying to maintain. I saw their car that afternoon. I saw how they came back alone, without his mother and father. I thought it was strange, but I kept quiet. Now, seeing this, I know they were hiding something. The truth, which had previously been only mine, now gained other voices. Every witness who spoke up was like a brick falling from the wall of appearances my son and daughter-in-law had built. And I watched, before my very eyes, the collapse begin. My son screamed, "You're all against me." She was always manipulative, a bitter woman who invents stories. His voice was no longer firm. It was a desperate cry echoing off the marble walls like the wail of a frightened child. The tailored suit no longer hid the sweat pouring down his face, the lost look in his eyes, the shortness of breath. The daughter-in-law, unable to withstand the pressure, sat down, covering her face with her hands. Her tears were not of remorse. They were of fear of the imminent fall. It was then that my husband, though weakened, stood up, leaning on his makeshift cane. His voice, hoarse and low, silenced the hall more than any scream. "She saved us twice. When we were pushed, it was her pretending that kept us alive. And now, it was her courage that brought us here." His words echoed like a hammer striking stone. There was timid applause, then stronger, until the entire hall seemed to acknowledge the truth. My son's face contorted in rage and despair. He tried to run toward me, perhaps to rip the phone from my hands, perhaps to finally silence the voice that haunted him so. But two guests stood up and restrained him. The authorities were called. And as we waited, my son couldn't stop lashing out with words. "You don't understand. I just wanted what was rightfully mine." She was never anybody. That final sentence was the killing blow. Because in that instant, everyone saw clearly that, to him, I was not a mother, not a woman, not a human being. I was just an obstacle. The crowd reacted with murmurs of disgust, harsh stares. Some even moved away, as if protecting themselves from something rotten. I, standing, looked him in the eyes. For the first time, not with pain, but with a calm firmness. I didn't need to shout anymore. His collapse was happening in front of everyone, without me lifting a finger. The weight of the lies, the arrogance, and the contempt now fell on his shoulders like heavy stones that no man can carry. I felt my heart slow down. For years I had feared the silence, but there, the collective silence of the hall was my greatest ally. Everyone was looking at him, not me. The shame for the first time was not mine. It was his. And then the doors burst open. The police entered, and the reflection of the red lights from outside painted the walls of the hall like an announcement of the end. The doors of the hall flew open violently, and the echo of police boots on the marble turned the silence into anticipation. The red and blue of the lights from outside flooded the room, tinting the guests' faces with an almost theatrical glow. It was as if the night itself had decided to take a seat at the table to watch the finale. 2 police officers advanced to the center, where my son was still trying to break free from the hands that held him. His voice was now just an uncontrolled wail. "This is a setup. She was supposed to be dead. She was supposed to be dead." With every repetition, more looks of horror turned his way. There was no denying it anymore. He was digging his own grave with his words. The daughter-in-law, huddled in a corner, was sobbing, but no one approached to comfort her. Even her closest friends knew. Tears shed too late do not wash away the poison in a heart. When the police announced the arrest, the entire hall seemed to let out its held breath. It was as if everyone had been waiting for this moment, even without admitting it. My son was handcuffed in front of everyone, and the metallic click echoed like a final sentence. I tried to picture the boy I once rocked in my arms, but I couldn't anymore. Before me was just a small man, consumed by his own greed. Some guests discreetly raised their cell phones, first to record, then to share. I saw one of the recordings begin to circulate immediately in group chats, and, in a matter of minutes, social media was already buzzing about the scandal. Son pushes parents to their deaths for inheritance. The makeshift headlines ran faster than the rumors themselves. My silence of decades now transformed into a digital echo. I no longer needed to defend myself. The proof, the images, and, above all, his breakdown were enough for the whole world to witness. For the first time I was not invisible. For the first time my face and my voice were at the center of the story. Across the hall, my husband raised his tired but firm gaze. I saw discreet tears run down his face, not of pain but of liberation. He touched my hand and said, "The shame was never ours. It was always theirs." I felt an ancient weight lift from my chest. For years I had carried the idea that I was the one who needed to hide, to lower my voice, to stifle my screams. But in that moment, in front of the cameras, the cell phones, the witnesses, I understood that my silence had only been the prelude to the revelation. As they led my son and daughter-in-law away under the flashes of cell phones and the indignant murmurs of the crowd, an unexpected calm washed over me. It wasn't happiness. There was no joy in watching a son fall. But there was justice. And justice, when it arrives, brings a kind of bitter but necessary peace. The guests began to disperse, some avoiding my gaze, others looking at me with a newfound respect. I saw in the eyes of many women a flash of identification, as if they were saying in silence, "We have been silenced too. Thank you for screaming for us." I just stood tall, firm, bearing the weight of it all with the serenity of someone who had survived her own death and returned to tell the tale. Outside, the buzz of social media grew like fire in dry straw. And I knew, my story would not end that night. It was just beginning to echo beyond the hall, reaching those who, like me, had once been silenced. The night had already emptied out by the time I returned home. The silence of the streets contrasted with the digital buzz I knew was growing. My name, once restricted to faded entries on certificates and family memories, was now spreading in videos, comments, and headlines. I was, at the same time, the victim and the survivor, the woman everyone believed was dead who had returned to turn silence into justice. I walked in through the kitchen door as I always had, but this time I wasn't carrying grocery bags or the fatigue of work. I was carrying the certainty that the burden of shame was not mine. I placed the cell phone on the table and stared at it as if it were an extension of my own life. That device, with its cracked screen and memory full of venom, had transformed into an invisible sword. My husband sat beside me, his breathing slow, his eyes moist. He touched my hand with the same tenderness as when we were young. "You did it," he said, almost in a whisper. I shook my head. No, it wasn't just me. It was all the times I swallowed sharp comments at family gatherings. It was all the times they asked me to dress better, so I wouldn't be an embarrassment. It was all the glances that slid off my body as if I were an inconvenient detail in the scenery. Every microaggression, every imposed silence, every veiled laugh was a brick in the wall my son believed he could build to erase me. And, ironically, it was those same bricks that crumbled in front of everyone. That night, looking up at the simple ceiling of my house, I realized something profound. The kindness I had always carried, the patience, the silence, the willingness to serve, was not weakness. Never was. It was strength. It was a choice. I could have always screamed, but I chose to be silent until I was sure my scream would echo. And when it echoed, no one could contain it. Thought of my son. The pain of betrayal still throbbed, and perhaps it always would. But alongside it was the certainty that I did not let him erase me. That his life would not be remembered for the title he sought, but for the mask that fell. And mine, for the courage to rise from the fall he believed was final. I lifted my head, took a deep breath, and smiled for the first time in a long time. Not a smile of joy, but of silent victory. I survived. I won. And, above all, I proved to myself that kindness is not synonymous with weakness. It is the most powerful disguise. And now, I speak directly to you, who have followed every word of my story. If it touched your heart, if you have ever felt that they tried to erase your existence, if you have been silenced at some point in your life, subscribe here to the channel. Your voice deserves to echo along with mine. When we unite, silence ceases to be a prison and becomes strength. Because in the end, the truth is this. They tried to throw me off a cliff to silence me. But it was at the bottom of it that I found the voice that changed everything.